the true story of a killer who lived in plain sight. The prison air was thick with the scent of bleach and concrete dust. In a dim interview room, a man in a faded orange jumpsuit sat with his hands folded neatly on the table, his posture almost formal. He smiled politely, like a man waiting for a business meeting to begin. He wasn't here to make small talk. He wasn't here to confess. Daniel Owen Conahan Jr. had been called many things over the years. Predator, sadist, monster, but perhaps the most chilling was neighbor. Before his name became forever tied to the Hog Trail Murders in Florida, Conahan lived quietly among retirees, families, and unsuspecting neighbors. By day, he shopped for groceries, waved to passing cars, and mowed the lawn. By night, he stalked the margins of society, places where the desperate and the transient lingered, invisible to most. In those shadows, he built his legacy, not of power, not of respect, but of blood. It was the kind of discovery that changes the air in a small town. On a sweltering June morning in 1996, Charlotte County deputies responded to a call about human remains found off a remote utility trail. The body, nude, bound, and partially decomposed, was lying just off the beaten path, concealed by palmetto scrub. The air was heavy with decay. The victim would later be identified as Richard Allen Montgomery, a 21-year-old known to frequent local labor pools. He had been strangled, sexually assaulted, and mutilated post-mortem. The brutality was undeniable, but the location was telling. The site was along an informal hunting route locals called the Hog Trail, where wild boars roamed and hunters carved narrow paths through the woods. It was secluded enough for a killer to work without interruption, yet close enough to a road for a quick escape. Investigators at first had little to go on. No eyewitnesses, no vehicle description, no immediate suspect. What they did have was the beginning of a pattern they would come to know far too well. The truth is, Richard Montgomery wasn't the first. Over the preceding year, skeletal remains of other men had surfaced in nearby counties. The victims shared haunting similarities. White males, often homeless or transient, many with connections to the local gay community. Each had been lured away, restrained, sexually assaulted, and dumped in remote woods. But because of their backgrounds, poverty, homelessness, criminal records, these disappearances didn't spark media frenzies. They were low-priority cases, sometimes filed away with little follow-up. This was the killer's advantage. He didn't have to hide from the spotlight. There simply wasn't one. The break investigators needed came not from a crime scene, but from a man who refused to die. In early 1997, a day laborer named Claude Moser accepted an offer from a clean-cut, middle-aged man who promised him $100 to pose for artistic photographs. The man was charming, polite, hardly the picture of danger. At the man's home, Moser was given beer and asked to undress. When he refused, the situation turned violent. He was tied up, assaulted, and threatened. But in a burst of panic-driven strength, Moser broke free, bolting naked into a neighbor's yard and screaming for help. His description of the attacker was precise. Neatly groomed, military haircut, driving a blue sedan. Within days, investigators had a name: Daniel Owen Conahan Jr. Born in 1954 in Charlotte County, Florida, Conahan was the only child of a middle-class family. His childhood appeared stable, no abuse, no major incidents. He graduated from Charlotte High School, joined the Navy, and trained as a medic. But Navy life didn't suit him. He was dishonorably discharged in the early 1980s after multiple disciplinary problems, including allegations of inappropriate behavior toward other men. Back in Florida, Conahan enrolled in nursing school, earned his license, and bounced between short-term healthcare jobs. He never married, never maintained long-term relationships, and lived for years with his parents. What friends he had described him as meticulous, odd, and sexually aggressive, particularly toward younger men. Behind closed doors, he developed a fascination with bondage and control. That fascination would eventually escalate into something much darker. Armed with Moser's testimony, police obtained a search warrant for Conahan's modest Punta Gorda home. What they found was a disturbing catalog of his private world. Dozens of nude male photographs, some depicting men tied to trees or bound with rope. Surgical instruments, including scalpels and clamps. A ledger with initials, dates, and locations, possible victim records. Rope, duct tape, and makeshift restraints. A stash of gay pornography with violent themes. In the garage, detectives found traces of human blood. Forensic testing later confirmed a DNA match to Richard Montgomery. The case against Conahan was no longer circumstantial, it was direct. In 1999, Conahan was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Richard Montgomery. The trial was swift. The prosecution painted him as a sexual sadist who hunted vulnerable men for pleasure, staging elaborate bondage scenarios that ended in slow, intentional death. The jury took only 2 hours to recommend the death penalty. Conahan was sent to Florida's death row, but investigators suspected he was responsible for far more than one murder. Diving deeper into the Hog Trail Murders, the Fort Myers 8, and the investigation that tied them all to Daniel Owen Conahan Jr. After Richard Montgomery's body was found in June 1996, Charlotte County Sheriff's Office began combing through old case files for similar unsolved murders. What they found was a chilling series of patterns. Between 1994 and 1996, at least 6 male victims had been discovered in wooded areas across Charlotte, Lee, and Sarasota counties. The victims' bodies shared disturbing similarities. Found nude or nearly nude, bound with rope or similar restraints. Evidence of sexual assault. Post-mortem genital mutilation. Disposed of in remote hog hunting trails. These trails, often no wider than a person's shoulders, were known mostly to locals and hog hunters. They wound deep into the Florida scrub, offering isolation and concealment. The press, picking up on the gruesome nature and location, began calling them the Hog Trail Murders. For the first time, law enforcement began to suspect that Richard Montgomery's murder was just one piece of a much larger killing spree. Most of the Hog Trail victims shared similar backgrounds. They were white males, aged 19 to 45, struggling financially, often homeless, unemployed or picking up work at day labor pools. Some identified as gay or bisexual, others were suspected to be closeted. Often last seen hitchhiking, drinking in bars, or looking for quick cash. Their disappearances didn't spark headlines or manhunts. In the mid-1990s, especially in rural Florida, a transient gay man's disappearance often met with shrugs or the assumption that he moved on. It was exactly this invisibility that Conahan exploited. He targeted those whose absences wouldn't immediately draw police attention, giving him the time and confidence to strike again. Forensic analysis of the crime scenes revealed more than just brutality. It revealed ritual. In each case, the victims were not simply killed. They were posed. Their bindings were intricate, almost artistic, using knots that suggested both medical precision and an awareness of human anatomy. The post-mortem mutilation was not random either. Investigators theorized it was part of Conahan's sexual gratification. According to behavioral profilers brought in by the FBI, Conahan's methodical approach suggested he was a process-focused killer, someone who derived pleasure from the prolonged control and suffering of his victims, rather than from the act of killing alone. A decade after Conahan's arrest, in March 2007, a shocking discovery in Fort Myers brought his name back into headlines. Construction workers clearing land for a new development uncovered human bones buried in shallow graves. As law enforcement dug deeper, both literally and figuratively, they unearthed 8 separate male skeletons. The remains were severely decomposed, with some still bound by rope. The state of the bodies and the burial method mirrored the Hog Trail killings. All 8 men were believed to have been murdered in the mid to late 1990s, during the peak of Conahan's known activity. Several were last seen in Fort Myers, a short drive from Punta Gorda, where Conahan lived at the time. While there was no smoking gun, no DNA that directly tied Conahan to the Fort Myers 8, investigators saw the similarities as more than coincidence. Same victim profile, white males, transient, often from labor pools. Same disposal style, remote, wooded locations with hog trails nearby. Same binding methods and signs of sexual assault. Geographic proximity to Conahan's home during the murders. Several of the Fort Myers 8 were known to have been approached by a man offering cash to pose for modeling photographs, the exact lure used by Conahan on survivor Claude Moser. For detectives, it was enough to label Conahan the prime suspect. But in the legal system, prime suspect doesn't mean conviction. On death row, Conahan was approached multiple times by investigators hoping to close the Fort Myers 8 case. He refused every interview request. Unlike some serial killers who bask in the attention and crave credit for their crimes, Conahan's refusal was absolute. Whether it was pride, fear of additional charges, or a desire to deny closure to the families, no one could say for sure. His silence meant the Fort Myers 8 would remain legally unresolved, their families forced to live without definitive answers. The investigation also exposed uncomfortable truths about law enforcement priorities in the 1990s. Many of the victims were gay men during a period of high stigma, leading to reduced urgency in missing person reports. Transient victims often lacked close family, meaning there were no persistent advocates demanding answers. Multiple counties investigated separately, failing to connect patterns across jurisdictions until years later. If these men had been from middle-class neighborhoods with strong community ties, some officers admitted, their disappearances might have been investigated more aggressively, and the killing spree might have ended sooner. Conahan remains on Florida's death row today, convicted only of Richard Montgomery's murder but suspected in at least a dozen others, including all of the Fort Myers 8. For residents of Charlotte and Lee counties, the Hog Trail Murders left a lasting scar. For the LGBTQ+ and transient communities, they were a reminder that their safety was not valued equally in the eyes of the law. And for the families of the unidentified victims, the legacy is one of unanswered questions, a silence as chilling as the crimes themselves. All right, here's part 3 of Behind the Legacy, bringing the investigation into the present and closing with a strong, reflective conclusion. By the mid-2010s, advances in forensic science began offering a glimmer of hope for the families of the Fort Myers 8 and other suspected victims. Techniques like asterisk familial DNA searching, forensic genealogy, and isotope analysis, tools that had helped solve decades-old cold cases across the U.S., were now available to Florida law enforcement. In 2020, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, partnered with the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NAMAS, to re-examine the unidentified remains. Using bone and tooth samples, forensic anthropologists were able to extract degraded DNA profiles from several of the victims. Some of these profiles were run through national databases, leading to partial matches that narrowed down potential family trees. One victim was eventually identified as a 27-year-old man from Georgia who had last been seen hitchhiking to Fort Myers in 1996. Another was tentatively linked to a missing person from Ohio. For the first time in decades, families were getting phone calls that both confirmed their worst fears and gave them long-awaited answers. Cold case detectives began interviewing people who had lived and worked in Fort Myers and Punta Gorda during the mid-1990s. Some remembered Conahan from bars or labor pools. Always neat, polite, sometimes a little too friendly. A few men recalled being approached by him with offers of quick money for photo sessions but had turned him down. One man, who had been homeless at the time, admitted he came close to accepting but got a bad feeling and walked away. That gut instinct may have saved his life. Several of these accounts match details in surviving victim Claude Moser's statement, further solidifying investigators' belief that Conahan had a pattern, one that spanned years and crossed county lines. For the relatives of victims, justice has been a long, uneven road. Some families have pushed prosecutors to charge Conahan with additional murders, even without airtight DNA evidence, arguing that the circumstantial case is overwhelming. Others have focused on memorializing their loved ones, holding vigils at the Fort Myers burial site, and pushing for all victims to be identified. What unites them is the shared pain of knowing their loved ones were targeted not just by a killer, but by a system that didn't see them as urgent cases. That injustice still burns. Daniel Owen Conahan Jr. remains on Florida's death row, housed at Union Correctional Institution in Rayford. He has been there for over 2 decades. He has filed multiple appeals over the years, arguing ineffective counsel and challenging the admissibility of certain evidence, but all have been denied. He has not confessed to any other murders and has shown no remorse for the one he was convicted of. In prison, he is known to keep to himself, polite, quiet, almost forgettable. Guards say he is easy to manage, a far cry from the predator described in court, but the violence in his past never fades from the public record. When you strip away the sensational headlines and the horror of the crime scenes, Conahan's legacy is not about him. It's about the people left behind. It's about the unidentified men whose bones still rest in evidence lockers, waiting for a name, the families who fought for decades to be heard, the survivors who carry memories of close calls and the knowledge of what could have been, the investigators who still work the case long after the cameras have moved on. It's about the systemic failures that let a man like Conahan hunt for years without detection. Failures rooted in prejudice, economic inequality, and the undervaluing of certain lives. The Hog Trail Murders and the Fort Myers 8 stand as a grim case study for law enforcement across the United States. Our missing persons cases must be taken seriously regardless of a victim's social standing. Cross-jurisdictional cooperation is crucial for spotting patterns in serial crimes, and bias, whether conscious or unconscious, can cost lives. For the U.S. audience, this story is more than a Florida crime tale. It's a reminder that the safety of a community is only as strong as its ability to protect its most vulnerable. Today, the hog trails in Charlotte County still wind through the brush, overgrown in places but passable if you know where to look. Hunters still roam them, as do hikers and curious locals. To an unknowing passerby, they are just dirt paths under the Florida sun. But to those who remember the 1990s, they are something darker, corridors of memory, lined with the ghosts of men who never made it home. The killer sits in a cell, aging behind concrete walls. But his legacy, the real one, lives on in the lessons his crimes forced us to face. And somewhere in a cold case file room, detectives still believe there are more names to add to the list, more trails to walk, more families to call. The story isn't over, not until every victim has been found and every name is spoken aloud. For more chilling through crime content, subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell to be notified immediately a new content is uploaded.